Welcome back to Oncology for the Inquisitive Mind, where we have moved on from the small cell lung cancer space, which sometimes feels a little bit depressing, and we're moving to another area which may also be a little bit depressing, but do not worry, there is always light at the end of the oncology tunnel. Today, I am joined by my Queensland co-host who loves the Broncos and nothing better than sitting on a jellyfish-infested beach. Michael, it is good to see you.
Josh, you forgot the most important part, which is with a 4X beer clenched in my hand. I think you called it Queensland's greatest export.
I did study and live there for a number of years, and I was a wee 18-year-old, and I got invited out to a pub, which I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to a pub. And this guy called Matt, he was really cool, like Queensland bloke, wore the short shorts, quite built and played rugby and all that sort of stuff. He's like, have this beer. And so I did, and it was disgusting. I'm not so much of a beer drinker, but you know who could do something with beer? This is a terrible segue, Michael. No one. But our topic today is mesothelioma, and a historically rough drug. I'm not going to go much into the background because Michael can probably sum it up in 15 seconds or less. So Michael, let's hear what you have to say. And before you do say anything, don't forget to like and subscribe.
I do want to come back to that core memory, though, of being invited out. It sounded like that was the main reason that you were so excited.
Yeah, it was all the week,
Oh my gosh, the rugby player has taken notice of me.
Week, I moved to North Queensland. Initially, my mother had helped me find friends, I love you, Mum, not you're listening anymore to the podcast. Shout out to Mum. But I was like, this is so cool.
So cool. Anyway, something that's not cool, kids, is asbestos and mesothelioma. Mesothelioma, we've talked about it in the past. It is an insidious disease, and it is a disease that occurs after exposure to asbestos. And one thing I found in reading up for this study, Josh, is that asbestos can occur naturally. It is mined. There have been incidences of asbestosis and mesothelioma found as early as Roman times, but it was only in the early 20th century that people started really using it for construction. And we all know how well that ended. The way that asbestos actually leads to mesothelioma, the deposition of asbestos fibers in lung parenchyma can lead to penetration of the pleura. This is why it's a pleural-based disease. And that can be sort of transported, sucked to the parietal pleura, leading to development of mesothelial plaques. Now, there's some evidence that suggests that the asbestos is absorbed intracellularly by macrophages and actually starts interacting with the DNA. So it cuts right to the heart of the cell. There's also the thought that long, thin fibers, so blue asbestos, are more potent carcinogens than what's called feathery fibers, which is white asbestos, because they can sort of sneak into the small gaps and penetrate the pleura. Common gene abnormalities, although as far as I'm aware, none of these have actually been able to be taken advantage of, are BAP1, neurofibroma type 2, P16 and P14, and the ever-present P53. The tragic thing, and probably something that led to a bit of a delay in the association between asbestos and mesothelioma, is there is a significant latency. So the latency is around 40 years between asbestos exposure and the development of mesothelioma. As a result, typically affects patients who are greater than 60 years old, with the highest incidence of patients who are aged 75 to 80. The classic mesothelioma patient is a former tradie. Builders, electricians, anyone who would have had a lot of exposure, miners, if they were mining the stuff. That's the multi-choice question. STEM. Builder presents with weight loss and persistent dry cough. That's pretty much guaranteed to be mesothelioma. Worryingly, Australia has one of the highest incidences of mesothelioma in the world. As of 2018, there were 700 to 800 new cases per year. But fortunately, after asbestos was banned in 2004, the incidence has appeared to peak. So hopefully this is something that will become less and less common. And if you're listening to this episode in 40 or 50 years on your electric skateboard, on your hoverboards, then you might never have seen incidence of mesothelioma. We can only hope. It is associated, of course, still with a very poor prognosis. But there have been advances, small and stuttering as they may be. And Josh, you're going to start us off with probably the biggest one, which is immunotherapy. Isn't it always immunotherapy on this show?
It is at the moment, Marty McFly. So we are moving to Checkmate 743. There is at least 3 years of follow up. And if we talk about the highlights, let's go to the highlights first, and then we can go into the details. Bit like ASCO, the start of ASCO. So with a greater than 3 years of follow up, Checkmate 743, ipilimumab, and nivolumab continue to provide long term overall survival benefit in first line mesothelioma patients. The clinical benefit was maintained consistent across subgroups, including epithelioid and non-epithelioid, Michael. Discontinuation due to treatment-related adverse events did not negatively impact long-term benefit. Because I suspect those that are going to benefit will continue to benefit, and those that don't will not. This was a phase 3 randomized open label trial. The prior outcomes are terrible with chemotherapy, but patients with unresectable malignant pleural mesothelioma were included. They were combined to the dual immunotherapy agents or the standard of care, which is pemetrexed and cisplatin or carboplatin, and the primary endpoint, overall survival. Secondary endpoints was objective response rate, disease control rate, progression-free survival, everything I say every single episode. The interesting point is that the ipi-nivo, so nivolumab was given every 2 weeks in this trial initially, and then every 6 weeks in ipilimumab or 6 cycles of chemo, and then stop. 605 patients randomized. Minimum follow-up time was 35 months and 43 months in the control arm. And we found, and not me personally, but the trial design and the guys who did all of this, the smarter people, found there was an overall survival benefit versus chemotherapy, about 18.1 months versus 14.1 months. The 3-year OS was 23 versus 15%, and that was seen across subgroups. Moving on to epithelioid, and this is where it gets a little interesting. So the confidence interval crossed 1, but the hazard ratio was 0.85. And in the non-epithelioid arm, the hazard ratio was 0.48. So the benefit in the non-epithelioid was far greater than the epithelioid. But the median overall survival was actually similar in both of these arms, irrespective of the histology subtype. So the 3-year overall survival for the chemotherapy was 16.9 months, or 19% in the epithelioid, and 8.8 months and 4% in the epithelioid. So you can see in the non-epithelioid, if you're given chemotherapy, you do pretty terribly. So I think that's, I always just get confused. You give it, do you not give it? And then there's some really great Kaplan-Meier curves looking at the median overall survival. And you can see there is initially a little chemotherapy blip, which shows benefit. And then after about 3 to 4 months, you see that dividing of the curves. And there is a tail end even up to really the 48 to 50 months, showing a benefit of the dual immunotherapy agents. Very few patients, but there are some that are there. And then if we go and look at the overall survival for I think it's the epithelioid, is 18.2 versus 16.7 months with a hazard ratio of 0.85, if I remember that correctly. I did remember that correctly, Michael, so that's quite good because I didn't put it in my notes. And then the non-epithelial, you see that massive difference there, and it is a striking difference. And then you've got the progression-free survival, which actually showed a slight benefit for that of the chemotherapy arm, right? So that's something that's quite interesting. But I think in those that are going to respond, they will do better in the immunotherapy agent. I think that's what we do know. And even the response rates is marginally higher in the chemotherapy arm. But interestingly, duration of response, still superior in immunotherapy. Michael, one final thing to mention before I hand over to your trial. So yes, it does benefit. You use it in both subtypes. I think that's what I would do. I don't treat that much mesothelioma anymore, but that's my interpretation of this trial. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really comes down to the fact that ipi-nivo, despite it being a problem in terms of toxicity, it has its own problems, of course, but it is generally better tolerated and more palatable for patients than chemotherapy. So if the survival is a wash, you're going to default to the one that is, on average, less toxic. And it's worth emphasizing as well that, the non-epithelioid subtype of patients, frequently sarcomatoid, did really badly before immunotherapy. They did really, really badly, and chemotherapy really didn't benefit them, as you said. So ipi-nivo is generally the standard of care, regardless of what type of mesothelioma you've got.
One final thing, Michael, just the exploratory analysis, unless I get a third phone call during this. is they also did a inflammatory signature, which is quite interesting. It was a 4-gene panel. And what they found is that those that had high inflammatory signature actually did quite well versus those that did not. So the median overall survival was 21 months in this cohort, up to 33 in patients with a high inflammatory score versus 16.8 months in those with a low inflammatory score. I don't think we implement this, but it is just interesting when you look at biomarker analyses.
And it sort of makes sense. If you've got a high inflammatory score, you're more likely to be what we call immune hot. And so you're more likely to have recruitment of immune cells to the cancer, and they're more likely to have an impact. But not something that we use in clinical practice, but it's always interesting, as you say.
That's it. Michael, what's your story?
Yeah. What's my story? Well, I was born in 1863. The story of the study that I'm going to do, it's a study called MAPS. And last week I promised that this episode would not simply be a rehash of an earlier episode because there hasn't been a whole lot of change in mesothelioma in the last couple of years. But I did find one. It's not really clinically relevant, although it might be. You'll have to listen to find out. But this is a study called MAPS. It was published in 2016. So it predates the onset of ipi/nivo. It is an attempt to get our old friend bevacizumab to have a part to play in the treatment of cancer. So the standard of care at the time of the publication was doublet chemotherapy, as Josh has said, cisplatin, carboplatin, or plus pemetrexed. But VEGF signaling pathways play a crucial part in the mesothelioma cell pathophysiology. There have been some studies with single-agent bevacizumab which demonstrate only modest activity. So MAPS, MAPS, stands for Mesothelioma Avastin Cisplatin Pemetrexed Study. And it was a phase 2-3 study that examines the adhesion of bevacizumab to standard doublet chemotherapy. We won't talk about the phase 2 part. Suffice to say that its primary endpoint was 6-month disease control rate, and it met its primary endpoint. So we will talk about the phase 3 part of MAPS, which took place at 73 hospitals in France. They recruited 448 patients who were randomized 1-to-1 to receive doublet chemotherapy plus Bev, PCB we'll call it, pemetrexed, cisplatin, bevacizumab, or PC alone. Inclusion criteria: patients had to have histologically proved malignant pleural mesothelioma, not amenable to curative surgery. I don't think I've ever seen a mesothelioma that was amenable to curative surgery, but hey. Patients had to have no previous treatment, had to have an ECOG performance status of 0 to 2. They had to have no significant cardiovascular comorbidity. Obviously, the main toxicity of bevacizumab is hypertension, higher rates of cardiac disease, high rates of strokes, high rates of renal impairment, proteinuria, that sort of thing. So not having those at a baseline is always helpful. So exclusion criteria: if patients had CNS metastases, anticoagulant or NSAID use, uncontrolled hypertension, hemoptysis or major surgery within 28 days of enrollment, or history of bleeding diatheses, coagulopathy, recent MI or CVA, history of congestive cardiac failure, arrhythmia, abdominal fistula, or gastrointestinal perforation within 6 months. All stuff that if you saw and you had bevacizumab in your hand, you would throw it in the other direction and would not put it in the patient. The primary outcome was overall survival. Secondary endpoints were progression-free survival, quality of life, and safety. Not much to say about the demographics other than they were very well balanced. So in terms of the results, there was a small but significant, statistically speaking, benefit in overall survival, 18.8 compared to 16.1 months with a hazard ratio of 0.77. When you look at the subgroups, there was significant crossing of the line of equivalence, pretty much in all major subgroups. So I don't know what you actually do with that information, but it is important to say that, the benefit is a little bit hazy when you look at the subgroup breakdown. PFS, very similar story, 9.2 compared to 7.3 months, hazard ratio of 0.61, again, statistically significant. There were significantly lower rates of subsequent therapy in the PCB group, 62 compared to 72%. I honestly don't know after chemotherapy what subsequent therapy is, probably some other type of chemotherapy. But there were higher rates of improvement in fatigue assessed by the QLQ C30 questionnaire, but no difference in any other assessed areas. We spoke about an exploratory analysis in Josh's study. Well, I've got one for you here because they explored correlation between serum VEGF concentration, which is not something I've ever seen before. And interestingly, they basically took all the patients and found the median result. And for those who had a lower than median, lower than average VEGF concentration, they had a greater degree of benefit with bevacizumab than those with a higher VEGF concentration than the median. 5.3 compared to 2.3 months of benefit of bevacizumab over chemotherapy by itself. Again, not something that we use. It does make sense in that if you have less VEGF, the bevacizumab is going to be more total in its blocking, and you're going to have a better anti-cancer effect. In terms of safety, there were higher rates of hemorrhage, cardiovascular adverse events, hypertension, and VTE in the PCB group. Nothing that we have not seen before. So, to conclude, it's an interesting study. Sort of before the onset of immunotherapy, this was probably the extent of how much progress had been made in mesothelioma. It is a treatment option for patients with epithelioid mesothelioma particularly. Say, for example, they've got significant autoimmune history and you really can't give them immunotherapy. You could give them chemotherapy and bevacizumab. A sarcomatoid or non-epithelioid subtype, you really want to give that IO, as we mentioned. This study was not in second line, so the benefit is uncertain if it's given after IO, but we're probably in a bit of an evidence-free zone in second-line treatment of mesothelioma. Anyway, this is not caught on in Australia. It might have caught on in other parts of the world. It's not approved by the PBS, but bevacizumab in Australia has recently progressed to an unrestricted approval, so you can pretty much use it wherever. So it is something that theoretically could be done. It's not something that I've seen significantly. There also might be significant crossover for patients who have mesothelioma, those patients who have issues that would lead to difficulty in tolerating bevacizumab, hypertension, history of cardiovascular disease. Remember that mesothelioma predominantly affects older people. So something just sort of to throw in there, I guess. It's not going to be the thing that completely changes outcomes, but maybe a bit of sprinkling on top.
There you go, Michael. I did miss half of your presentation.
Josh has no notes because he's got better things to do.
No, because I subsequently got distracted and had a phone call.
Well, that's what you get when you're just as popular as the man from Melbourne.
Yeah, I don't think it's that good to be popular. Just putting it out there. What are we doing next week?
Next week, so we have completed our thoracic oncology phase, you might say, and we are going to my sort of area of interest, which is colon cancer and colorectal cancer. So we are going to be speaking about early colon cancer, and we're going to be talking about the ideas cohort, which is very interesting and very, very confusing for newcomers. So definitely worth listening. And we'll be obviously giving rectal cancer its own day in the sun because that is a completely different kettle of fish. We hope you will join us as Oncology for the Inquisitive Mind continues south into the bowels of the problem.
Fantastic, Michael. We'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Oncology for the Inquisitive Mind, produced by ADC Productions with the assistance of education grants from Pfizer, Gilead Pharmaceuticals, and Merck Pharmaceuticals. As always, these companies do not receive early previews or editorial input of any kind. The opinions expressed in this episode are our own, and the facts are, well, the facts. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing to be among the first to hear our latest forays into the ever-changing world of medical oncology. You can find previous episodes of our show, including coverage of major conferences, interviews with world-renowned experts, and much more at inquisitiveonc.com. If you would like a particular subject covered on the show, drop us a line at inquisitiveonc@gmail.com. And if you happen to be in Australia, stay tuned for details about exciting in-person events we have planned for the near future. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to demystifying oncology again next time.